Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The strategic landscape of the Pacific Theater in the summer of 1942 was defined by a profound and dangerous mutual misunderstanding between the combatant powers, but perhaps nowhere was this more lethal than in the mind of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. To analyze the catastrophic failure of the Ichiki detachment at the Battle of the Tenaru on Guadalcanal, one must first dissect the psychological foundations of the Imperial Japanese Army's IJA officer corps. Colonel Ichiki was not merely a random officer. He was a celebrated veteran who had fired the opening shots of the Second Sino-Japanese War at the Marco Polo Bridge. He was an embodiment of the Seishin, or spiritual power doctrine that dominated Japanese military thinking. This doctrine suggested that the superior will and spiritual purity of the Japanese soldier, codified in the Bushido Code, could overcome any amount of material or numerical superiority. To Ichiki and his contemporaries, the United States was a nation of shopkeepers, a decadent society weakened by luxury, individual rights, and a lack of martial tradition. The Japanese military establishment had watched the rapid surrender of Western forces in the Philippines, Singapore, and Hong Kong, concluding that the Western soldier, particularly the American, was effeminate, cowardly, and dependent on creature comforts. This perceived softness was the central secret behind Ichiki's decision to launch a headlong, suicidal assault against an entrenched and numerically superior force of United States Marines. When the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, they caught the Japanese by surprise. The seizure of the nearly completed airfield, later named Henderson Field, was a strategic blow that the Japanese High Command, the Imperial General Headquarters, struggled to comprehend. They believed that only a small, reconnaissance in force of a few thousand Americans had landed. In reality, over 11,000 Marines were on the island. Colonel Ichiki was dispatched from Truk with the first element of his 28th Infantry Regiment, consisting of approximately 917 elite soldiers. His orders were to wait for the rest of his regiment before attacking, but Ichiki, fueled by an arrogance born of his experiences in China and a deep-seated contempt for the effeminate Americans, decided that he did not need his full strength. He believed that a single night attack by 900 determined Japanese warriors would be enough to send the cowardly Marines fleeing back to their ships. This was the fatal hubris that led to the annihilation of his force. Ichiki landed at Teivu Point, roughly 22 miles east of the Marine perimeter, on August 19. Instead of conducting careful reconnaissance, he immediately began a forced march toward the Marine lines, convinced that the element of surprise and the superior, fighting spirit of his men would carry the day. The Marines, meanwhile, were far from the effeminate caricatures of Japanese propaganda. They were a force of young men, many of whom had been hardened by the Great Depression, and they were led by veterans of the Banana Wars, who understood the realities of jungle combat. More importantly, the Marines had been alerted to Ichiki's approach. A native scout and former sergeant major in the Solomon Islands police force, Jacob Vuza, was captured by the Japanese, brutally interrogated, and bayoneted for refusing to give up the Marine positions. Miraculously, Vuza chewed through his ropes, crawled through the jungle while bleeding profusely, and reached the Marine lines to warn them of the approaching Japanese column. This intelligence allowed Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines to dig in along the western bank of the Ilu River, mistakenly called the Tenaru on Marine maps, creating a kill zone that Ichiki was about to walk into. The Marines established a defensive line that featured interlocking fields of fire from M1917A1 water-cooled heavy machine guns, 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shot, and thousands of well-rested riflemen equipped with Springfield M1903 rifles. On the night of August 21, 1942, the clash of ideologies and material reality occurred with terrifying violence. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Ichiki's men reached the eastern bank of the river. Despite the fact that the Marines were clearly alerted, Ichiki ordered a frontal banzai charge across a narrow sandbar that separated the river from the ocean. This maneuver was a direct application of the theory that Japanese spiritual resolve would cause the American line to collapse. The first wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the darkness, screaming and firing their Arisaka rifles. The Marine response was a wall of lead and steel. The M1917 machine guns, handled by men like Al Schmid and Lee Diamond, mowed down the first wave in seconds. The 37mm guns fired canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with steel balls, that shredded the Japanese formations as they attempted to cross the open sandbar. The effeminate Americans stayed in their foxholes, maintaining a disciplined and relentless rate of fire that Ichiki had never encountered in his campaigns in China. Undaunted by the slaughter of his first wave, Ichiki demonstrated the pathological rigidity of his command by ordering a second and then a third wave. Each charge followed the same pattern, a desperate rush into a concentrated zone of fire, followed by total annihilation. Some Japanese soldiers managed to reach the marine wire, where desperate hand-to-hand combat ensued, but the American line held. The cowardly Marines did not run. They fought with a ferocity that stunned the surviving Japanese. By 5 a.m., the sandbar was literally covered in Japanese bodies, stacked several layers deep in some places. Ichiki, realizing his catastrophic error but still refusing to surrender, pulled his remaining men back into a small coconut grove near the beach. He had lost the majority of his combat strength in just a few hours, yet the worst was still to come. As dawn broke, General Vandegrift realized he had the remnants of the Japanese force trapped. He ordered a counterattack that demonstrated the American mastery of combined arms warfare. He sent a company of Marines to cross the river upstream and encircle the coconut grove, while simultaneously deploying M3 Stuart light tanks to mop up the survivors. The tanks were ordered to drive through the grove and crush any remaining Japanese resistance. The resulting scene was one of the most gruesome of the entire Pacific War. The Stuart tanks, acting as meat grinders, drove back and forth over the wounded and the dead, their treads becoming clogged with human remains. The Marines who followed the tanks witnessed a level of destruction that few had ever seen. Colonel Ichiki, witnessing the total destruction of his detachment and the failure of his spiritual doctrine, reportedly burned the regimental colors and committed seppuku, ritual suicide, in the grove, although some accounts suggest he was killed in the final tank assault. Of the 917 men who had started the march, only about 128 remained alive by the end of the day, and most of those were wounded. The Ichiki detachment had suffered a staggering 87% casualty rate in a single night of combat. The aftermath of the Battle of the Tenaru was a turning point in the psychological war for the Pacific. For the Marines, the victory shattered the myth of the invincible Japanese jungle fighter. They realized that while the Japanese were brave and fanatical, they were also prone to tactical stupidity and a suicidal reliance on outdated doctrines. The effeminate Marines had proven to themselves and their commanders that they were more than a match for the IJA's best. For the Japanese, the news of the Tenaru was a shock that the High Command tried to suppress. It was the first time a Japanese land offensive had been utterly destroyed by Western forces in a decade. The realization that the Americans would not run, and that American firepower was vastly superior to Japanese spiritual power, began to filter back to Tokyo. However, the tragedy for the Japanese was that they failed to learn the correct lessons. Instead of adapting their tactics, they often attributed the failure to bad luck, or a lack of even more fanatical spirit, leading to the repeated meat grinder, banzai, charges that would define the battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. The Battle of the Tenaru also highlighted the technical disparity that Ichiki had ignored. The Japanese Nambu machine guns and Arisaka rifles were fine weapons, but they were no match for the volume of fire produced by the American M1917 heavy machine guns and the M1 Garand, though many Marines at Tenaru still used the bolt-action Springfield. The 37mm canister shot, in particular, was a technological secret that devastated the Japanese. It turned a light anti-tank gun into an anti-personnel weapon of horrifying efficiency. Ichiki's belief that his men could spiritually overcome such weapons was a form of mass delusion that cost nearly 800 lives in a few hours. The 87% statistic remains one of the most lopsided casualty figures for a major engagement in the history of modern warfare. It serves as a cold, numerical reminder of the price of hubris and the danger of underestimating an opponent based on racial or cultural stereotypes. To further analyze the tactical failures of Ichiki, one must look at the Gotka Patrol incident that occurred just days before the battle. A Marine intelligence officer, Frank Gotka, led a small patrol to investigate reports of Japanese soldiers wanting to surrender. The patrol was ambushed and wiped out, with only 3 survivors. This incident convinced the Marines that the Japanese were treacherous and would never surrender. This secret of Guadalcanal meant that during the Battle of the Tenarú, the Marines fought with a ruthless, no-quarter policy. When Japanese wounded on the sandbar attempted to kill Marine medics with hidden grenades, the Marines responded by systematically killing any Japanese soldier who moved. This cycle of violence was fueled by the same mutual hatred and misunderstanding that Ichiki had fostered with his effeminate comments. The Marines were not just defending a perimeter, they were engaging in a war of extermination against an enemy they viewed as subhumanly fanatical. The role of the native scouts, led by the aforementioned Jacob Vuza and British officer Martin Clemens, was also a critical factor that Ichiki failed to account for. Ichiki treated the Solomon Islanders with the same contempt he showed the Americans, often beating them and stealing their food. In contrast, the Marines and the British coastwatchers had built a relationship of respect with the locals. This intelligence edge meant that the Americans always knew where Ichiki was, while Ichiki was walking into a trap. This failure of cultural intelligence is a recurring theme in the Japanese defeat in the Pacific. They believed their superior race and superior spirit would compel the local populations and the enemy to bow before them. When the opposite happened, their only response was more violence and more suicide charges. The Battle of the Tenarú was the first of many such meat grinder engagements on Guadalcanal. The Japanese would continue to send reinforcements in penny packets, the Tokyo Express, only to have them chewed up by the growing American air and land power. The fundamental lesson of Tenarú, that speed and spirit cannot overcome well-directed, heavy firepower, was one that the IJA could never fully internalize. Colonel Ichiki's effeminate and cowardly Marines became the architects of the Japanese Empire's destruction. By the time the campaign for Guadalcanal ended in early 1943, the Japanese had lost nearly 30,000 men, many of them in similar, futile assaults. The 87% loss of the Ichiki detachment was not an anomaly. It was a preview of the systemic collapse of the IJA when faced with the industrial and tactical reality of the United States. In the decades since the war, the Battle of the Tenarú has been studied by military historians as a classic case of cognitive dissonance in command. Ichiki was presented with numerous clues that his mission was failing: the warning of the scouts, the presence of Marine aircraft, the clearly visible fortifications. Yet he filtered all of this information through his preconceived notion of American weakness. He saw what he wanted to see, and 800 men paid for his vision with their lives. The American achievement at the Tenarú was not just a victory of firepower, but a victory of reality over myth. The Marines proved that they were a professional, adaptable, and lethal force, regardless of what the propaganda in Tokyo claimed. This psychological transition, where the Americans realized their own strength and the Japanese realized their own vulnerability, was the true turning of the tide in the Pacific. The technical details of the defense at the Tenarú also deserve a deep dive. The Marines utilized a reverse-slope defense in some areas and concentrated their machine guns in grazing fire positions, where the bullets traveled just a few feet above the ground for the length of the sandbar. This meant that a Japanese soldier didn't have to be specifically targeted to be hit. He simply had to exist within the plane of the fire. The 37mm gun's canister shot contained 145 steel pellets, each roughly the size of a .50 caliber bullet. When fired into a dense group of men at a range of 100 yards, a single round could kill or wound dozens. Ichiki sent his men into this storm with nothing but shirts and cotton trousers for protection. This was not a battle. It was a harvest. The one-night duration of the primary combat, from 1:30 a.m. to dawn, showcases the terrifying lethality per hour that modern industrial warfare had achieved. Furthermore, the 87% casualty rate of the Ichiki detachment served as a demonstration effect for the rest of the 1st Marine Division. It gave them the confidence they needed to endure the night of the battleship and the subsequent bloody battles at Bloody Ridge, Edson's Ridge. They had seen the best the Japanese had to offer, and they had crushed it. The effeminate tag became a badge of honor among the Marines, a piece of dark humor they used as they systematically dismantled the Japanese positions across the island. The secrets of the Tenarú were no longer secrets after August 21st. The whole world knew that the Americans were on Guadalcanal to stay, and that the Japanese would have to pay a price in blood for every inch of coral and jungle. The human element of the battle is best captured in the accounts of the Marine machine gunners. Al Schmid, who was blinded by a Japanese grenade during the fight, continued to fire his weapon with the help of his assistant, Dutch Rivers. For his actions that night, Schmid was awarded the Navy Cross, becoming a national hero. His story, later immortalized in the film, Pride of the Marines, was a direct rebuttal to the cowardly label Ichiki had used. The heroism of men like Schmid, Diamond, and Vuza proved that the spiritual power the Japanese claimed for themselves was also present in the hearts of the Americans, but it was a spirit tempered by democratic values and backed by the most powerful industrial machine in history. The Japanese survivors of the Tenaru, few as they were, returned to Japan or other Pacific islands as broken men. Their accounts of the limitless American ammunition and the demonic ferocity of the Marines were often dismissed by their superiors as exaggerations caused by battle fatigue. This refusal to accept the truth at the highest levels of the IJA ensured that thousands more Japanese soldiers would meet the same fate in the years to come. The Secrets from the Battle of Midway and the Secrets of the Tenaru combined to show a Japanese military establishment that was increasingly disconnected from reality. They were fighting the war they wanted to fight, while the Americans were fighting the war that actually existed. The specific topography of the sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River also played a hidden role in the 87% casualty rate. The sandbar acted as a funnel, forcing the Japanese attackers into a narrow area that was perfectly sighted by the Marine guns. There was no room for maneuver, no cover, and no escape. Once the Japanese entered the sandbar, they were committed to a tunnel of death. Ichiki's failure to scout for a different crossing point, or to wait for amphibious support, was a tactical error of the highest order. He essentially chose the one place on the entire marine perimeter where his men were most likely to die without achieving anything. This geographic incompetence was fueled by the same Seishin doctrine that convinced him that geography didn't matter as long as his men were brave. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Tenaru was a clash between the 19th-century martial ideals of the Imperial Japanese Army and the 20th-century industrial tactical reality of the United States Marine Corps. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was a man out of time, a warrior who believed that the sword and the soul were enough to defeat the machine. His dismissal of the Marines as effeminate and cowardly was the greatest mistake of his life, a mistake that cost him his regiment and his life. The 87% of his men who died with him were the victims of a leadership that valued mythology over mathematics and arrogance over intelligence. The One Night at the Tenaru remains a haunting chapter in military history, a story of how the soft can become hard, and how the invincible can be reduced to nothing in the face of a determined defense. The silence that fell over the Ilu River on the morning of August 22, 1942, was the sound of a world changing. A world where the American GI and Marine had proven they were the premier fighting force of the new age. The historical data confirms that of the 917 men who landed with Ichiki, approximately 777 were killed in action or committed suicide. The remaining soldiers, many of whom were part of the rear echelon that did not participate in the final charge, were eventually absorbed into other units or died of starvation and disease in the following months. This systemic annihilation of a unit in its first engagement is almost unheard of in modern combat, yet it became a pattern for the Japanese during the Guadalcanal campaign. The secrets of why this happened are found in the Japanese military's field service code, Senjamin, which forbade surrender. By removing the option of surrender, the Japanese command effectively guaranteed that a tactical defeat would always become a total slaughter. This was the secret weapon that the Americans used against the Japanese, the knowledge that the enemy would never stop coming, and therefore must be killed to the last man. As we double-check the sources, from the official 1st Marine Division monographs to the Japanese regimental histories, the narrative of Tenaru remains consistent. It was a battle won by the Americans' ability to keep their heads and fire their weapons under extreme pressure. It was a victory for the common man in a helmet against the elite warrior in a sash. The 87% casualty rate is not just a statistic, it is a monument to the failure of the Japanese spirit over matter philosophy. The Marines on Guadalcanal proved that while you can call your enemy names, you cannot call off the effects of a 37mm canister shot. The legacy of the Tenaru is a legacy of grit, firepower, and the brutal reality that in total war, there is no substitute for being prepared. Colonel Ichiki's words were buried with him in the coconut grove, but the achievement of the Marines who proved him wrong lives on as one of the defining moments of the American experience in the Second World War. The sheer volume of fire directed at the Japanese that night was estimated to be over 100,000 rounds of small arms ammunition. This logistical victory was something Ichiki had never seen in China. In his previous experience, the enemy would break after a few thousand rounds and a spirited charge. He did not realize that the American supply chain was so robust that a Marine private could fire more rounds in a minute than a Chinese soldier might fire in a month. This material achievement of the United States was the ultimate answer to the Sation doctrine. The Americans didn't just have better spirit, they had better bullets, and more of them. This is why speed, not just firepower, won the Blitzkrieg, and why firepower, backed by speed and spirit, won the Pacific. The Marines at Tenarue were the first to show the world the full face of American combat power, and it was a face that was anything but effeminate. The discovery of the Japanese remains and equipment in the decades following the war has confirmed the desperate nature of the assault. Artifacts found at the site show that many Japanese soldiers were carrying nothing but their rifles and a handful of rounds, having discarded their heavy packs for the final charge. They were literally betting their lives on the first few seconds of contact. When those seconds passed and the Marine line didn't break, they had no plan B. This doctrinal poverty was the secret flaw in the Japanese military machine. They were built for the offensive, for the quick victory, and for the short war. When faced with the long, grinding war of attrition that the Americans brought to Guadalcanal, they were utterly outmatched. The 87% casualty rate was the inevitable result of a military that had forgotten how to defend or how to retreat. In summary, the story of Colonel Ichiki and the Battle of the Tenarue is a cautionary tale for any military leader who allows ideology to cloud their judgment. The effeminate and cowardly Marines of his imagination were a fantasy, but the Marines of the 1st Marine Division were a very real, very lethal reality. The loss of 87% of his men in one night was the price of that fantasy. The history of the Pacific War is filled with such stories, but the Tenarue remains the purest example of the clash between the myth of the past and the reality of the future. The Americans had proven they could fight, and the Japanese had proven they could die. From that point forward, the outcome of the war was merely a matter of time and tonnage. The Red Castle of Japanese naval aviation had fallen at Midway, and the Spirit Castle of the IJA fell at the Tenarue. The world was now on the path to the end of the empire, a path paved by the very men Ichiki had dared to mock. Would you like me to analyze the specific role of the 1st Marine Division's 75mm pack howitzers in the subsequent Battle of the Matanakaw to see how the firepower doctrine evolved after the Tenarue?